I was having the best vacation of my life before I ended up alone in the middle of the ocean. Now, you might wonder how the heck a person would end up lost in the middle of the ocean on a family vacation. Well, you can say that my luck isn't exactly typical. Before everything had escalated to this, I was planning a trip with both of my parents to the Caribbean islands. You see, my family is kind of rich, the kind that can afford to rent out a private jet when they go on vacations, and that's exactly what we did. On the 1st of October, we packed our stuff and were ready to enjoy an adventurous weekend. I didn't pack much. In fact, I didn't need much. Just some clothes and my special parachute suit, which I always take with me on every vacation if I ever feel like parachuting. I could honestly tell you guys that parachuting is the thing that gets me excited the most. The sensation flying in the air can't be compared to any other feeling in the world. In most cases, my father jumps with me, and we land together on the island. However, this time, things kinda took a different turn. As I was getting ready to jump, I stood near the door of the jet waiting for my father as he was getting ready to join. When I looked down, I could see that we were almost near the land, and I was getting really excited to jump. The view looked so amazing. So I took out my phone from my jacket pocket and took a picture. But that's when something happened that took me off guard. My phone slipped from my hand, and I quickly leaned forward without thinking, hoping I would catch it. You could probably assume that at that point, what I did was very stupid because it had caused me to lose my balance and trip off the jet. Oh my God! I couldn't believe this was actually happening to me at the moment. Everything was so quick that I couldn't even utter a word or scream for help, and I started falling as I heard my parents screaming my name. I took a deep breath to calm myself down. And I just thought that I'll do what I always do, except that this time I was gonna land without my father. About 10 seconds later, the automatic parachute went off, which meant that something was wrong. It must have been the way I fell out of the jet, I thought. It was going too fast, and I did not jump correctly. I was heading towards the earth without any idea where I might land. But when I looked underneath, all I could see was water everywhere. I honestly wasn't sure if I'd land in the sea, but I was hoping I wouldn't, because it was going to be a big problem. Before I knew it, I had hit the ocean. I had to act fast to avoid drowning. I remembered the instructions that said if you land in the water, you must get your chest strap off to take the gear off quickly and swim beneath the parachute. Even though I was panicking like crazy, I tried to calm myself down, because I really needed to focus on what I was doing. Otherwise, I wouldn't survive. It took me a while before I managed to focus on the way I was swimming. I was honestly scared to death that my feet would get tangled up in the parachute and drown me with it. When I looked around me, all I saw was water. No ships, no land, no people, nothing. I took my shoes off to help ease my movement, and I swam around towards where I thought could be the way to the island. But I realized after a while that there was no way for me to know if I was swimming in the right direction. At that moment, I started realizing that I was in much bigger trouble than I thought I was in. I can't even describe the feeling I had. I have never been more scared in my entire life. My body was tired. Swimming started to become exhausting, and I honestly wondered whether that was going to be my last day alive. Then a thought hit me. I remembered all of the adventures I had taken with my parents and how there were a lot of hard times. At that moment, I knew that feeling sorry for myself wasn't going to get me anywhere. I needed to fight to stay alive. I never thought I would be put in that kind of situation. Well, to be fair, there were times that it had passed my mind, though I think everyone has had those kind of worst-case scenario thoughts, but never did I think of that. I thought about all the best ways to retain my energy. My biggest problem was that my body felt like lead. I didn't want to push myself too hard and sink to the bottom, so I decided to float for a while. However, with more time to think, more bad thoughts kept coming to mind. I was in the middle of the ocean. What if a shark came up from the water and decided to eat me? They could smell blood for miles, and their jaws could snap down on me quick. Even while I was floating, there would have been a shark creeping along the bottom of the ocean, just waiting for the right moment to attack. Needless to say, I was feeling uneasy. Even if it wasn't a shark, what if a freak storm hit and washed me further away from where my parents were looking? The weather around the island was supposed to be superb around this time of year, But that didn't mean the weather couldn't change at any moment. I knew deep down that it may have been illogical, but at that moment, logic seemed to be the last thing that made it to the top of my mind. I never felt so weak in my life. There was nothing I could control. If something went wrong all of the ways out here, I would end up dead, and my parents wouldn't even know what happened to me. I was out in the open with nothing to do but swim around, and I was hardly the fastest thing in the sea. There was no mistaking how vulnerable I was out there. So many thoughts that seemed to weigh me down more than my own tired body. I started to panic again and started to swim again, trying to do all I could to make some sort of safety fast. Then I thought better of it. I knew that I needed to calm down if I wanted to survive. The only thing I could do was wait. But if I used up all of my energy then and there, I wouldn't have any later in case I desperately needed it. I didn't know if there were any sharks around, but if there were, I would not go down without a fight. Those may have been empty words, but they made me feel better at the moment. I started thinking about other things. I wanted to fill the time by thinking about anything that would take my mind off of the situation that I was in. Lying there, looking up at the sky, I started to play little games in my mind. I looked at the clouds and found images in them. And then I would remember times that would fit with the image. I saw slopes and remembered how my family went skiing the year before. Skiing down the mountains and feeling the cold on my face while surrounded by the thick snow. The hot chocolate I drank when we all sat down in the lobby at the end of the day, and the fireplace in our room as we sat and played board games. It was one of my favorite memories of last year. The clouds started to drift through the sky, passing me by, on their way for their own adventure. I could see the sun start to dip in the sky, but I didn't know how much time had passed. My body was starting to ache all over. From hitting the water to swimming as hard as I could, I was pushing myself further than I ever had. The worst part was not knowing how much longer I would need to continue pushing. At that moment, I couldn't even panic. I was too tired to do anything else but float. Trying to do anything else would take too much energy. As the sun drifted lower in the sky, I thought how beautiful the orange glow over the water looked, and I started to wonder, would that be the last thing I saw before I died? When the sun had completely faded in the sky and the stars started to show, my body started to falter. I could feel myself dipping underwater and tried focusing all of my attention on staying afloat just a little longer. I could feel tears in my eyes, but they were covered by the water. I clenched my eyes shut tight, my mind once again drifting towards the negative. I wasn't going to be found. Maybe my parents were looking in the wrong place. And what if my swimming earlier was in the wrong direction and I made it harder on them? I started to come down on myself harder than I ever had before. I opened my eyes again and looked up at the stars. One stood out above all the rest. It was brightly reflected on the water, but when I looked up, I didn't see it. When the light got brighter and brighter, I realized that it wasn't a star, but a boat. I smiled to myself as it came closer to me. Then I used the last of my strength to scream out. As the boat came near, I could feel relief fill my body. I didn't know how long I was there, nor did I know if I would make it, but just being able to see help coming for me made all the difference in the world. The crew helped me up onto the boat and led me over to a small cot that they laid out for me. It wasn't until I was out of the water that I realized how cold I actually was. When they saw me shivering, they wrapped me up tight to fight off the cold night and headed off in the direction of the island. It was finally over. I was brought to the local hospital and waited for my parents to arrive. They fussed over me for quite some time, trying to make sure that I didn't have any cuts and bruises, and to make sure that I was rested and ate a nice meal. Even though I was surrounded by strangers, it felt good to be back on dry land again. When my parents burst into the room, I could see the worry on their faces. My body wasn't too beat up, but being in the ocean for so long made me look worse than I was. My dad immediately went to asking questions, trying to find out if there was anything wrong with me. My mom came to my bed and held me tight in her arms. I hugged her back, so happy to be near her again. When she finally let go, I could see that her eyes were red and puffy. My dad came over to me next and apologized for not getting there sooner and told me how he hired every available boat to search for me. I shook my head and gave him a hug too. I was just happy that he was there now. From then on, I knew not to take life for granted Every moment is precious and should be spent appreciating everything that you have, because you never know when it may be gone. So yeah, call it bad luck or even a stupid mistake. I can't really argue with either one, but I'm just glad that it had a happy ending.
I hated that place. I hated Emily, and I hated my mom for doing this to me. Mr. Amberson was my only chance. I wrote his name on Facebook and started searching all the pages full of people who had the same name, but I didn't know what I was looking for, and all the photos I found were of strangers. If only I could remember the address, but my search turned out to be fruitless. I succumbed to the reality of me living a life with a huge secret that I would never uncover. But that didn't last for long. A few days later, the principal requested for me to go to her office again. I started to hate hearing the word principal and office in the same sentence. But what waited for me there was something I never expected. The principal didn't take away my box for nothing. She also knew that what was in those letters were no ordinary words. She took up my mission of finding Mr. Amberson with great respect for my mom's wishes of keeping everything a secret. When I got to the office, the principal was sitting behind her desk, and across from her sat a man I had never met in my life before. But for some reason, that man made me feel something I couldn't understand. He made my heart feel warm. He kind of looked familiar, even though I was sure I had never met him in my entire life, not even once. I sat directly in front of him. I couldn't take my eyes off him, even when the principal was talking to me. I knew my staring was making him uncomfortable. I noticed he was nervous as he too stared at me. The principal's words meant nothing to me, to the point that I didn't understand anything of what she was saying until I heard her say, "Mr. Amberson." "You're Mr. Amberson?" I screamed loudly. I asked her to explain everything. She told me that she took the box from me because she wanted to help me. She instructed the police to find Mr. Amberson because if I had a relative, I'd be able to leave the orphanage. But that would depend on Mr. Amberson. The man started speaking instead of her. He told me he was sorry for my mom's death, and I could see that he was barely able to hold back his tears. He said that if he'd known about her death, he would have gone to the funeral to be there with me, and that he'd never leave me here. Now all I had to do was to go collect my things so I could go with him. Everything was happening so fast, and I still didn't have answers for the questions swirling in my head, but at least I'd found him. The answers I'd get later. Mr. Amberson lived in a city far away from here. My heart was beating fast as we drove along the long roads. I couldn't understand why it was beating so fast, so much so that it actually hurt a bit. Mr. Amberson didn't say a word the entire way, but I could no longer bear the silence. I tried to start a conversation with him and asked, "Were you related to my mom?" He shook his head without saying a word. "Did you know me? Because I don't remember meeting you before, and yet I have this feeling that tells me that I've met you before." He looked at me for a second before saying, "All right, the last time I saw you, you were just a 1-year-old. You look so much like your mom, exactly like I expected you to be." I replied, "Yes, everyone used to tell me that." And then we continued our ride in silence until we arrived at a house. I decided along the way that I was going to tell him about the money and the box once we arrived. But as usual, my plans didn't succeed. The pain in my chest increased. My hand grasped at my heart and I started to look pale. Mr. Amberson looked at me and asked if I was okay. I wasn't able to answer. I felt my heart beating so fast it might explode. Swiftly, Mr. Amberson took me to the hospital. When I got there, they did a whole full body check. It went on for hours and hours. I wasn't thinking of my heart, or my mom, or the scared looks on the faces of the doctors around me. All I could think about was the moment when Mr. Amberson would finally reveal what my mom had been hiding from me. After finishing the tests, Mr. Amberson sat next to me and started asking me about my mom. Where was she for all those years? What did she work as? How did we spend those last years? When he was done with his questions an hour later, I said, "You look like a nice man. Why did my mom break contact with you and all of our relatives?" Then he said, "It was because of your father, dear." My father? Was he my father's relative? That would explain everything. Now it made sense why he'd met me when I was a child. Now I understood why my mom specifically chose him without telling me the reason. Maybe she thought that if I knew he was a relative of my father's, I wouldn't want to have contact with him. My father who abandoned me as a child without a reason. That man didn't deserve my mom. She had been a kind and nice woman. But unlike what my mom might have thought, I wouldn't have refused to meet up with my father's relative. The money she left behind must have been for him to take care of me, to ensure my future. I was relieved that the secret she'd kept from me wasn't that catastrophic after all. It was no longer necessary to open the topic of the box with him anymore. All my worries had been for nothing. During this time, I wasn't the only one with thoughts whirring through their brain. The doctor revealed the results of my tests. He told me I had a hereditary disease in my heart and that it was the same illness that had killed my mom. He then continued and said that I had to undergo surgery to implant a little device that would provide extra support to my heart whenever it got weak. He assured us that the surgery was completely safe, but I was still really afraid. All this time, I'd been ignoring the pain in my chest. I didn't want to imagine that I might end up like my mom. I didn't want to die in that way. At least, not now. In the beginning, I refused the surgery. However, Mr. Amberson was my legal guardian and he agreed on the surgery. Not only that, he also convinced me that everything was going to be fine. And he was right. I stayed in the hospital for a whole week until I got better. And Mr. Amberson never left my side. He received many texts and calls, but he ignored them all except one, which I overheard. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but I was asleep and I heard him whispering, "Yes, she's all right. Soon she'll return with me home. Don't worry, everything is turning out exactly as we planned." I assumed that Mr. Amberson was married and he was just assuring his family that everything was fine. That meant I'd have more nice relatives. That made me feel something new. This was the first time I understood what it meant to have a family. Yes, my mom had been enough for me. But that didn't mean that I didn't dream of having a bigger family. The awaited day came. Now, I was going to leave with Mr. Amberson and go back to my new home. I was very excited, but I never expected any of the things I found there. Mr. Amberson wasn't his usual self and was nervous, even mumbling his words. It was strange, but I paid it no mind. Once we arrived, he looked at me and said, "Now you're going to meet my wife Clara and my daughter Melanie. They're really nice. You're going to love them." Then we entered his house. I was shocked at what I saw. His daughter looked exactly like me. Same hair, same eye color, same height. She also had one dimple on her right cheek. Who was she? Was it possible that Mr. Amberson is... No, that wasn't possible. My dad was a bad person. That was what my mom had told me. There's no way this good man was my dad. Or was he? Had my mom just told me lies? His daughter got closer to me and tried to say hi, but I started crying hysterically. I couldn't stop myself. I just fell on the ground. I was devastated. What could be worse than this? Who should I believe? My mom who'd left me without answers, or this man whom I'd only known for a week? Who am I? And if this man was truly my dad, why didn't he say anything the first time he saw me? Everything around me was hazy. His wife led me to a room they'd prepared for me. She told me to rest. But before she left, she said, "Jake has been dreaming of meeting you his entire life. We understand it's hard what you're going through, but don't take a side before hearing your dad's side of the story." Yes, he was my dad. After an hour, Mr. Amberson entered the room. Or should I say, my dad? My dad entered the room. I refused to look at him. I felt as if all the people I trusted in my life had lied to me. I no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. He started telling me everything from the beginning, and I don't mean from the day I was born. I mean from the day he first met my mother. It was during a wedding for a friend of his. My mom was 20 and he was 24. He fell in love with her at first sight. After only a couple of months, they decided to get married. And they did. Everything kept happening way too fast. They had me after a year, but I wasn't alone. I had a twin sister, Melanie. That explained why we looked so much alike. After our birth, things started going south with him and my mom. She couldn't bear all the responsibilities life kept throwing at her. She kept telling him that she could no longer stand living with him. He tried so hard to make things work because he loved her so much, but that didn't happen. He was a real estate broker, a successful one. He was putting some money aside in order to buy a bigger house, since the one they had wasn't enough. My mom started working in a car shop, even though my dad insisted that she stayed home and take care of us. But one night, he woke up to find my mom and me gone. She'd also taken the money he'd been saving and had left a note. In it, she said, "I can no longer tolerate life with you. I can't do this anymore. I've taken Tris and Elena, and I've left you Melanie in the house. That way, it's equal. I wish Sheila had a life." Later, we found out that my mom left him to be with her boss from work, who soon after left her and went back to his family and children. My mom disappeared after that, and that was the last he heard from her. He couldn't find her, and today he finally understood why. After she ran away, she changed our last name so that he could never find us and take me away from her. I was so shocked. I never expected my mom to be the one who left my dad. She lied to me all those years, but now I could understand why. She must have been so embarrassed, especially because her fling with her boss didn't even last. Maybe that was the real reason she never had a relationship with anyone else after that. She was ashamed of herself. Even though I was angry, I couldn't stay that way with my mom for very long. My mom had been a great person to me. And I mean, everyone makes mistakes. As for my dad, I told him that my mom stayed faithful to him all her life and that she made sure I'd meet him after her death. I showed him what was inside the box. He held the money and started crying. That day was definitely one of the hardest days of our lives. However, things started getting better as the days went on. My sister looked so much like me. It was crazy weird. We didn't grow up together, but we had the same tone of voice. She liked the same movies I did. She even acted like me. Spending time with her was really fun. As for my stepmom, she loved me so much, but she couldn't replace my real mom. Every day, I told my sister stories of our mom so she could share the memories of her and so she could know what an amazing person she'd been. And my dad, well, we became so close. It was as if we'd lived together our whole life.